On Tuesday, December 2nd, Netflix released a documentary that didn't feel like a premiere. It felt like a warning. Sean Combs. The Reckoning appeared
We're
without
losing.
spectacle, but within hours it dominated conversations across media, law, and culture. 4 parts, one central figure, and a sense that something carefully hidden for years had finally surfaced. From the opening minutes, the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't a celebration of success. The documentary moved slowly, deliberately, almost clinically, as if every second was designed to make viewers sit with what they were seeing. Old footage appeared first, moments that once looked ordinary, even harmless. But placed into context, those same moments felt heavier. Expressions lingered, pauses stretched, meaning crept in where comfort used to live. What made the series feel different was the confidence behind it. There was no frantic energy, no defensive framing. The structure itself suggested preparation, strategy, and hovering behind the entire project was 50 Cent. Not shouting accusations, not demanding attention, but shaping the narrative through pacing, sequencing, and restraint. This wasn't chaos. It was controlled exposure. Then the material began to surface, video clips that had never been broadcast publicly, not rumors, not reenactments, actual footage carefully dated and placed, scenes that once passed unnoticed, suddenly felt unsettling when viewed without excuses attached. The documentary didn't rush past them. It let the camera sit long enough for discomfort to settle in. Then came the call recordings. Real conversations, real voices, calm, confident, almost casual. The kind of tone that only exists when someone believes consequences don't apply to them. The documentary didn't interrupt. It didn't explain. It simply let the calls play. And when they ended, the silence that followed did more damage than commentary ever could. Almost immediately, viewers reacted differently. This wasn't background watching anymore. People leaned forward. Social media filled with clip scenes, slowed down audio, screenshots of dates and timelines. Legal analysts paused episodes frame by frame. Journalists reopened files they hadn't touched in years. The question changed fast. Not, is this shocking? But how was this allowed to stay buried? Before going deeper into this video, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That's how you'll never miss any breaking updates like this. Now let's get back to the story. What made The Reckoning feel dangerous wasn't just what it showed. It was how sure it seemed of what would happen next. There was no hesitation in its pacing, no uncertainty in its direction. The series moved like it knew the impact it would have once the material reached the public eye. Media coverage followed quickly. Headlines shifted tone. Words like alleged quietly faded, replaced by phrases like previously unseen footage and newly surfaced material. Industry figures went silent. Some distanced themselves. Others said nothing at all. And in moments like this, silence speaks louder than denial. Behind the scenes, attention shifted in a way that couldn't be ignored. Not from fans, from legal observers. Because when evidence reaches this level of visibility, it stops being a documentary issue and starts becoming a legal one. The series didn't demand action. It created conditions where inaction looked impossible to justify. By the end of the opening stretch, one truth settled in clearly. Sean Combs. The Reckoning wasn't closing a chapter. It was opening a door that had been locked for years, a door leading far beyond Netflix, far beyond public opinion. Because once material like this enters the public record, control disappears. And when control disappears, consequences begin moving closer. What followed next is where the documentary stopped feeling like a story and started feeling like a file being opened in public. The pace slowed even further, not to build suspense, but to force attention. Every second felt intentional. Nothing was rushed, nothing was softened. The footage came first, not recycled clips, not moments already debated online. These were videos most viewers had never seen, preserved pieces of time that suddenly carried weight. Some were years old, others felt uncomfortably recent. The documentary didn't rely on shock, it relied on context. Dates appeared, Locations were named, sequences were laid out carefully, and when those elements lined up, scenes that once felt meaningless began to feel calculated. The camera lingered longer than expected, long enough for expressions to change, long enough for body language to speak, long enough for viewers to realize that what mattered wasn't what was said publicly back then, it was what happened quietly afterward. Then the calls were introduced, not summaries, not reenactments, real recordings, uninterrupted, voices steady, confident, almost relaxed. The kind of tone that doesn't sound defensive or fearful. It sounds assured, protected. The documentary didn't explain the calls. It didn't guide interpretation. It let them play in full, and the silence that followed felt deliberate, like an invitation to sit with what had just been heard. What unsettled people most wasn't aggression. It was normalcy. These conversations didn't sound desperate. They sounded routine. And when those calls were placed on a timeline beside the footage, a pattern began to form. One call here, a decision there, an outcome that followed quietly. Over and over again, different situations, same structure. Former insiders appeared next, not chasing attention, not performing. People who had been close enough to see how decisions were actually made when cameras weren't around. Some spoke cautiously, weighing every word like risk still existed. Others spoke with a calm that only comes after years of carrying something heavy. Different backgrounds, different years, the same underlying dynamics. One described a location, another described the same place from a different time. One recalled a phone call, another described what happened immediately after that call. They weren't trying to match stories. They didn't need to. The alignment happened naturally, and that's what made it hard to dismiss. Legal analysts watching closely began pointing something out almost immediately. This wasn't edited like entertainment. Evidence wasn't dropped for shock. It was introduced methodically. Dates mattered. Order mattered. The structure resembled something far more serious than a show. It resembled preparation. Online reactions shifted again. Shock gave way to belief. Belief turned into urgency. Viewers stopped arguing opinions and started asking questions that hadn't been asked loudly before. Why wasn't this examined earlier? Who knew? Who looked away? Journalists began reopening old reports. Lawyers began commenting publicly. Viewers tagged media outlets, not asking for takes, but demanding accountability. Because once people believe they are watching documentation instead of performance, patience disappears. And hovering over all of it was one unsettling realization. This material didn't surface by accident. Someone had saved it. Someone had protected it. And someone had chosen this exact moment to release it, when it could no longer be quietly dismissed or buried. By the time this stretch ended, one thing was clear. Control had slipped. The narrative was no longer being shaped by statements or carefully worded denials. It was being driven by what had already been seen, heard, and recorded. And once that happens, the direction of the story can only move one way. Forward. As the documentary moved deeper, the focus shifted away from footage and recordings and landed on something far harder to dismiss: the people who had lived with the consequences of silence. This was where the distance between the screen and reality collapsed, where the story stopped being abstract and started feeling uncomfortably close. One by one, faces appeared that most viewers had never seen before. Not celebrities, not commentators, just individuals who said their lives had intersected with power at moments they didn't fully understand at the time. They didn't open with accusations. They opened with memories. How contact began, how access was framed, how trust was built slowly, almost invisibly. What made these accounts unsettling wasn't drama. It was how ordinary they sounded at first. Meetings that felt professional, invitations that seemed routine, opportunities that looked like success. The documentary let these moments breathe because that's where the pattern became clear. Nothing felt dangerous at the start. It never does. Then the tone changed. Each voice described a moment where boundaries blurred, where pressure replaced choice, where saying no didn't feel like an option anymore. Different cities, different years, different circumstances, yet the same structure kept appearing. Influence used quietly. Consequences implied, not stated. Silence rewarded. Resistance punished without explanation. Some admitted they tried to speak up once, privately, to the wrong people, at the wrong time. Others said they watched what happened to those who did and learned quickly what survival required. The fear in their voices didn't sound exaggerated. It sounded learned, calculated, like something shaped over time. The documentary didn't interrupt them. It didn't rush past hesitation or cut away from long pauses. When voices cracked, the camera stayed. When sentences trailed off, they were left unfinished. Those moments carried more weight than any accusation could, because truth doesn't always sound confident. Sometimes it sounds like someone pushing past years of restraint. What made it impossible to ignore was how naturally these stories aligned with what viewers had already seen. Locations matched the footage. Time frames lined up with call records. Emotional reactions mirrored the tone captured on tape. No one needed to connect the dots out loud. The connections formed on their own. Experts appeared briefly, not to inflame the narrative, but to explain it. How power imbalance works. How consent becomes complicated when one side controls access, reputation, and future. How silence is often mistaken for agreement when fear is involved. This wasn't opinion, it was context. Online, the reaction shifted again. Outrage gave way to recognition. People began commenting that the stories sounded familiar. Not identical, but close enough to be unsettling. Others admitted they had dismissed rumors years ago because it was easier than confronting what silence can protect. Industry voices stayed quiet, and that quiet grew heavier with every passing hour. By this point, the documentary had crossed into territory that couldn't be undone. The conversation was no longer about whether these stories were believable. It was about why so many people had felt unable to tell them until now. Because when multiple voices step forward independently, telling stories that echo each other without coordination, disbelief starts to sound less reasonable. It starts to sound like denial. And with every testimony shared, the pressure didn't just increase, it deepened. Not driven by outrage, but by consistency, by credibility, by the slow realization that silence had protected power far longer than truth ever should have. At that moment, it became clear this story was no longer building toward a reveal. It was already moving toward a reckoning that no one could stop. Once those voices were heard, the story refused to stay contained. What had started as a Netflix release spilled into the real world almost instantly, and the reaction wasn't slow or scattered, it was overwhelming. Clips from the documentary spread across platforms within hours, replayed again and again, not for shock value, but for scrutiny. Newsrooms shifted their tone overnight. Entertainment panels were replaced with legal discussions. Analysts paused footage frame by frame, replayed audio word for word, and began lining scenes up with timelines pulled from public records. Old reports, once ignored or forgotten, were suddenly reopened. And the more connections were made, the harder it became to dismiss what people were seeing as coincidence. Social media pressure didn't come in waves, it came in a flood. Viewers weren't debating opinions anymore. They were demanding accountability. Hashtags trended globally. People who had never followed the story before began asking the same question. How did all of this stay hidden for so long? Silence from powerful figures became impossible to ignore. Some distanced themselves quietly. Old photos disappeared. Public praise vanished. Others said nothing at all. But in moments like this, silence doesn't protect. It exposes. Because when everyone is watching, absence becomes a statement. Behind the noise, something more serious was happening. Legal observers noted that this level of attention mattered, not because courts respond to outrage, but because credibility had reached a point where ignoring it would raise questions of its own. This wasn't a single allegation circulating online. It was a convergence of footage, recordings, testimony, and corroboration unfolding in public view. According to reports that began circulating after the release, legal
We have
teams
to find
connected to
somebody
past
that'll
civil
work with
matters
us that has
were
dealt
already
in the
reviewing the
dirtiest of
documentary
dirty business.
professionally.
We're losing.
Clips were cataloged. Audio was transcribed. Interviews were cross-checked, not to comment publicly, but to assess relevance. Because once material enters the public record at this scale, urgency changes. Then came the development that quietly shifted everything. Cassie Ventura's legal team made contact, not through social media, not through press statements, through formal, legal channels. The message was precise and measured. Material revealed publicly, now aligned with information already known privately, and additional corroboration had begun to surface since the documentary aired. New confirmations, new connections, people recognizing their own experiences reflected back at them. That detail mattered more than most realized, because when public exposure breaks isolation, evidence multiplies. Individuals who once believed they were alone suddenly understand they were part of a pattern, and patterns demand scrutiny. Reports suggested the court was watching closely, not reacting to headlines, but to substance. Media coverage wasn't slowing, it was intensifying. Every hour brought new analysis, new legal questions, new pressure for clarity. By this point, the burden had shifted. Ignoring
We
the
have to
material
find
no
somebody
longer
that'll
looked
work
neutral.
with us, that
It
has
looked
dealt in
deliberate.
the
What
dirtiest of
began as a
dirty business.
documentary had
We're
become a
losing.
catalyst. And once that happens, the story no longer belongs to the screen. It moves forward, toward a place where debate gives way to decision and silence gives way to consequence. As the noise outside grew louder, the real movement happened in silence. This was the phase most people never see, where reactions stop mattering and processes begin. Away from cameras and comment sections, attention shifted to substance. What could be verified? What could be corroborated? What could no longer be ignored? Legal teams began reviewing what had surfaced with a different lens, not as viewers, not as critics, as professionals trained to look for overlap, consistency, and risk. Clips were watched again, this time without narrative framing. Recordings were replayed alongside timelines. Testimonies were compared not for emotion, but for alignment. And what emerged wasn't chaos, it was structure. What stood out most wasn't a single piece of material. It was how often different elements pointed in the same direction without touching each other. Independent accounts referencing similar locations. Separate recordings aligning with specific moments. Details that matched without coordination. That's when concern deepens, because coincidence stops being a reasonable explanation. According to reports circulating among legal observers, communication intensified, not publicly, formally, the kind of exchanges that don't make headlines but move cases forward. Material already known privately was re-examined in light of what had now entered the public record. And the public record matters, because once something is widely visible, it changes how urgency is measured. The tone shifted everywhere. Defense voices that once spoke freely grew cautious. Statements slowed. Responses became measured. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything said now carried consequence. Silence in this stage isn't absence, it's preparation. Behind closed doors, discussions reportedly centered on scope, not whether attention was warranted, but how far a review should go. When information has the potential to affect sentencing, safety, or public trust, the margin for delay shrinks fast, and delay itself becomes a risk. Observers noted subtle signals, files reopened, archived material revisited, scheduling conversations that hadn't existed weeks earlier, suddenly taking shape. None of it dramatic on its own, all of it meaningful together. And this wasn't a reaction to pressure. It was a response to alignment. Because systems don't move when they feel watched. They move when they feel exposed to error. And the accumulation of material had begun to pose a question no one could comfortably answer. What happens if this is left unaddressed? By the end of this stretch, one thing had become clear to those paying attention. The story had passed the point where opinion could shape outcome. It had entered a phase governed by obligation. And once obligation takes over, momentum changes. The narrative was no longer being driven by what people were saying. It was being driven by what could be proven and what might happen if it wasn't examined. What followed wasn't loud and it wasn't public, but it was unmistakable. This is the stage where stories stop evolving and systems start responding, where attention turns inward, where decisions are prepared before they're ever announced. Those watching closely noticed the change immediately. The rhythm shifted, communications tightened, timelines that once felt distant suddenly felt close. When institutions begin to move, they rarely do it in the open first. The signs appear in subtle adjustments, meetings scheduled quietly, materials requested again, questions asked with new urgency. The material that had surfaced was no longer being treated as commentary. It was being examined for exposure, risk, consequence. Footage was reviewed without narrative framing. Recordings were assessed for context and consistency. Testimonies were weighed against each other, not for emotion, but for alignment. The process was methodical, stripped of spectacle, focused on one thing only. What happens if this is left untouched? That question carries weight. Legal observers noted how quickly silence became strategic. Public confidence faded. Statements slowed, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything now mattered. When systems reach this stage, words aren't used to persuade, they're used to protect. Behind closed doors, discussions reportedly narrowed to scope, not whether review was necessary, but how far it should go. When material threatens the integrity of an outcome, restraint becomes liability. And liability demands action. The atmosphere changed. What once felt theoretical now felt procedural. Notices prepared, schedules adjusted, communication moved from informal to official. Each step small in isolation, but together unmistakable. Momentum had begun to form. Those closest to the process understood the implication. This wasn't routine housekeeping. This wasn't optics. This was escalation. The kind that happens when unresolved questions collide with credible material. And once escalation begins, there's no neutral ground left. By the time word started circulating that all relevant parties were being called in, the gravity of the moment settled. This wasn't about revisiting old arguments. It was about confronting what had accumulated quietly, patiently, over time. The story had crossed a threshold. From that point on, it was no longer shaped by reaction or narrative. It was shaped by obligation, by responsibility, by the understanding that not acting now would create consequences far greater than acting ever could. The path forward wasn't visible yet, but it was set. And when systems reach that point, they don't turn back. They move toward decision. By the time everyone gathered, the tension was already thick. Not because of cameras or spectators, but because everyone in the room understood that this meeting wasn't routine. It wasn't procedural. It was the result of pressure that had been building quietly, piece by piece, until ignoring it was no longer an option. The atmosphere was restrained, controlled. Every movement felt deliberate. This was where narratives ended and evaluations began. What had lived for weeks in clips, timelines, and testimony was now being addressed with precision. No dramatics, no speeches, just careful acknowledgement of what had accumulated. References were made without embellishment. Material was recognized without argument. The process moved slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of gravity. When institutions slow down like this, it's because they understand the consequences of moving too fast and the consequences of not moving at all. The dynamic in the room had changed. Confidence that once felt automatic now felt measured. Responses were careful, language softened. Not because there was nothing to defend, but because the ground beneath the defense no longer felt stable. When questions came, they weren't broad. They were narrow, specific, anchored in sequence and consistency. What became clear in those moments was how much the context had shifted. What once appeared fragmented now read as connected. What once felt isolated now felt patterned. And with that realization came a different kind of weight. Responsibility. There was a pause that carried meaning. Not confusion, recognition. Because when a system built on procedure pauses like that, it's not stalling, it's recalibrating. It's acknowledging that the situation before it is no longer the same as the one it was designed to address originally. The shift wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. You could feel it in the way attention narrowed, in the way options quietly disappeared, in the way the future began to look different than it had just days earlier. This was the moment where containment failed, Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The realization settled that whatever happened next would not be cosmetic. It wouldn't be symbolic. It would reflect the full weight of what had surfaced and the implications of leaving it unresolved. Outside, the world would debate. Headlines would simplify. Opinions would clash. But inside that space, something far more important had already occurred. The case was no longer being viewed through its original frame. It was being viewed through a new one. And once that frame changes, outcomes follow, whether anyone is ready for them or not. From that point forward, there was no return to comfort, no retreat to uncertainty. The story had reached a stage where decisions were no longer optional. They were inevitable. The moment arrived without spectacle, but it carried a finality that no one in the room could ignore. The review had reached its end, not because there was nothing left to examine, but because everything that needed to be seen had already been placed on the table. The shift was immediate. What had been discussed in fragments was now addressed as a whole. Footage, recordings, testimonies, timelines, not separately, together. The weight of it
We
didn't
have to
come from
find
any
somebody
single
that'll work
piece,
with us that has
but from
dealt
how
in the
tightly
dirtiest
everything
of
fit
dirty
once it was
business.
viewed in full
We're losing.
context. Patterns replaced explanations. Consistency replaced doubt. This was the turning point. The moment where the process stopped asking whether the situation could be managed and started asking what accountability now required. The conversation narrowed. The options thinned. What once felt flexible now felt fixed. There was no drama in how it unfolded. No raised voices, no visible reaction, just a steady acknowledgement that the scope had changed, and with it the consequences. The decision that followed reflected that reality. What had previously been treated as contained was no longer seen that way. The response matched the scale of what had surfaced, not the comfort of past outcomes. This wasn't symbolic. It wasn't incremental. It was decisive. In that instant, everything recalibrated. The future that once felt predictable disappeared. The protection that once felt assumed dissolved. The gravity of the moment settled slowly, but once it did, it was unmistakable. This was not a pause. This was a line being crossed. Those paying attention understood exactly what had happened. The system had moved from review to action, from consideration to consequence.
From hesitation to resolution.
Outside reaction would explode later. Headlines would condense the moment into a few charged words. Commentary would follow. Debate would rage. But none of that mattered inside the room where the decision had already taken shape. Because once a system built on restraint chooses escalation, it does so with full awareness of what it means. It acknowledges that the cost of inaction has become greater than the cost of action. And that acknowledgement changes everything. From that point forward, the story no longer belonged to speculation or narrative framing. It belonged to outcome, to consequence, to a reality that could no longer be adjusted for comfort. The reckoning was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and with it, a final shift that ensured nothing would ever return to the way it was before.